organization that you might be representing, and you can start your testimony.
Thank you. My name is Dane Waters. I'm the founder and chairman of the Initiative and Referendum Institute at the University of Southern California. I'd like to thank the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission to give me the opportunity to speak. I'm not here to speak either for or against the initiative process, but to provide some historical perspective on what's being considered. I'd like to begin with a quote from a speech that Teddy Roosevelt gave on February 21st, 1912, here in Columbus, to the Ohio Constitutional Convention. And by the way, my testimony has been submitted to the commission, and you probably have it with you. Teddy Roosevelt said, "I believe that the initiative and referendum should be used not as a substitute for representative government, but as methods of making such government really representative. Action by the initiative or referendum ought not to be the normal way of legislation, but the power to take it should be provided in the Constitution, so if the representatives fail truly to represent the people on some matter of sufficient importance to rouse popular interest, then the people shall have in their hands the facilities to make good the failure." He went on to say, "Give the legislature an entirely free hand, and then provide by the initiative and referendum that the people shall have power to reverse or supplement the work of the legislature should it ever become necessary." The entire speech of what Roosevelt said, and I have a copy if you want it, is quite enlightening if you have the opportunity to read that. Roosevelt acknowledged that the initiative and referendum should not be used, it should be used as the exception and not the rule. And as you know, this is outside my testimony a little bit, but if you look at the initiative process across the country, roughly 2,400 laws have been proposed via the initiative process in over 100 years, and roughly 40% have been adopted across the country in the 24 states that have it. The primary issue I want to address today is the requirement being considered about the 55% requirement. The general requirement in every state for passage of constitutional amendments through the initiative process and just through through the normal initiatives or amendments put on the ballot by the legislature is a simple majority vote. There are exceptions. Nebraska, Massachusetts, and Mississippi allow a majority vote for passage of amendments, provided the votes cast on the amendment equal a percentage of the total votes cast in the election. For example, 35% of the people who voted in the election must vote yes in Nebraska, 30% in Massachusetts, and 40% in Mississippi. Wyoming requires an amount in excess of 50% of those voting in the general election. Constitutional amendments in Nevada must receive a majority vote in 2 successive general elections. Florida requires a 60% supermajority for any constitutional amendment to be adopted. Colorado has a supermajority requirement of 55% for any constitutional amendment except amendments that exclusively removes language from the Constitution. For constitutional amendments, including its few initiatives, Illinois requires either 1, a majority of those voting in the election, or 2, 60% of those voting on the amendment itself. Oregon has a unique provision demanding that any measure proposing a supermajority requirement must pass by the proposed supermajority requirement. For example, Florida's 60% supermajority requirement was passed by 57.78%, which means it would have failed in Oregon. Though one can argue that any percentage for passage of an amendment greater than 50% is totally arbitrary, these regulations do exist. However, in not a single state and not a single country in this world is there a difference in what is required for the passage of a citizen initiative and what is passed by the citizens. And I recognize the comments made earlier by one of the members of the commission here about it's important because the citizens, quote unquote, to paraphrase, overuse the process, the constitutional process, and it's being abused. I will say that I applaud the commission for proposing ways to make the initiative process more usable. And every single state, when the legislature considers changes to the initiative process, what they consider is the difficulty in putting something on the ballot, not on what the final passage is. So the disparity, I mean the debate, you can make the debate about whether it's more difficult to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, but at the end of the day, it's very difficult logically, to be honest with you, to understand why when the citizens are at a ballot box, and I see an amendment by the legislature, an amendment by the initiative process, that one requires 55% and the other does not. Either you have faith in the people to pass an initiative, or you don't. You have faith in the people to pass an amendment, or you don't. So if the debate is about making it more difficult to put an amendment on the ballot, that is the debate across this country. But the debate about making it more difficult for the citizens to pass it while allowing legislative amendments to pass at a lower threshold, as I said, is something that honestly I have never heard of in this country, doesn't exist anywhere in this country, and would make Ohio an outlier in that regard. So I'd like just to leave you with one simple quote by William Jennings Bryan from his address to the Nebraska Constitutional Convention in 1920. "We have the initiative referendum in Nebraska. Do not disturb them. If defects are discovered, correct them and perfect the machinery. Make it possible for the people to have what they want. We are the world's teacher in democracy. The world looks to us as an example. We cannot ask others to trust the people unless we ourselves are willing to trust them." And that's where I would leave my comments, is that, once again, either you trust the people or you don't. And requiring them to give a 55% vote versus when you put something on the ballot at a 50% vote, honestly, I think sends the message that you don't really trust the people. So that's my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waters. Next